Hello everyone! In today's video, we dive into the latest article by Dr. Turki Faisal Al-Rasheed, published in Arab News, Timeless Leadership Lessons for a Turbulent World. Before we begin, let me introduce the author. Dr. Turki Faisal Al-Rasheed, a Saudi businessman, academic, and thought leader. As an adjunct professor at the University of Arizona and advisor, American University of Beirut, Faculty of Food and Agricultural, Dr. Turki Faisal Al-Rasheed, founder of Golden Grass Inc., he brings a rare blend of vision, expertise, and real-world insight to every article he writes. Dr. Al-Rasheed is also a distinguished author. His recent published book, Saudi Arabia, Transformation, Uncertainty, and Sustainability, explores the kingdom's evolving economic and social landscape amid global change, offering deep insights into development, resilience, and long-term sustainability. Let's dive in.
True strategic leadership does not react to history's storms. It charts a bold new course through them.
That is quite the quote to start us off.
Right. But what happens when that storm lasts for 100 years?
Yeah, that is the real question.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a really compelling piece published in Arab News by Dr. Turki Faisal Al-Rasheed. It's titled Strategic Leadership in the Public Sector: Timeless Lessons for a Turbulent World.
And it is a fascinating read.
It really is. And for you listening, whether you are, trying to make sense of macroeconomic shifts, managing a complex organization, or just trying to be a deeply informed citizen, the framework we are looking at today completely reframes how we evaluate success and failure in leadership.
Absolutely, because we are dissecting a landscape defined by intense geopolitical friction, economic volatility, and just profound societal transformations.
Yeah, the heavy stuff.
Exactly. And the core premise here is that standard administrative tactics, the things that worked perfectly fine 20 years ago, they're fundamentally failing under the weight of these modern pressures.
Well, let's ground this before we get into the heavy historical cycles.
Yeah.
Because the author makes a really stark division between strategic management and strategic leadership, right?
He does, yeah. They are treated as entirely separate disciplines.
Because standard public administration is frequently treated like managing a highly complex logistics network.
Right, keeping the engine running.
Exactly. You need personnel to keep the supply chains moving, ensure the power grid stays online, balance the quarterly budgets, and that kind of management is vital. But it's like keeping the engine running and swabbing the decks of a ship.
Right.
But strategic leadership is being the captain navigating that ship through a Category 5 hurricane.
That's a great way to put it. The distinction really lies in the objective. Management is the architecture of efficiency. It is systematic planning, allocating resources and monitoring performance to ensure the existing machinery just operates smoothly.
Just following the manual.
Exactly. But leadership, particularly in the strategic sense, requires visionary thinking. It's about the construction of organizational cultures that don't just survive disruption, but actually, weaponize it to their advantage.
To put a sharper point on it, think about running a massive tech company. Strategic management is keeping the current servers from crashing, right? Optimizing the code you already have.
Yes.
But strategic leadership is realizing that artificial intelligence is about to render your entire product line completely obsolete. And making the agonizing decision to migrate your entire user base to a completely new architecture while the system is still live.
That captures the friction perfectly. And, the difficulty multiplies exponentially when you apply this to the public sector.
Oh, I bet.
Because in your tech company example, the ultimate metric is commercial profit. If the stock goes up, the leadership worked.
Simple enough.
Right. But in the public sector, Dr. Al-Rasheed points out that strategic leadership is shackled to a much more complex, often contradictory set of metrics.
Like what?
Well, transparency, equity, accountability, and this very nebulous concept of the public interest.
Right. Which brings up a massive vulnerability in how we actually govern.
Yeah.
Because public interest is so subjective, the author really stresses there is no universal checklist.
No, not at all.
You can't just download a prescriptive framework for democracy or development, plug it into a new country, and expect it to just boot up and run.
Exactly. Local realities and deep-seated historical contexts outweigh any imported external model every single time.
It's like building a house, right? Management is the contractor following the blueprint perfectly. But leadership is the architect who realizes the ground is literally shifting underneath them, and they have to alter the entire design mid-build.
That's exactly it. What functions flawlessly in a small, homogeneous Scandinavian nation might trigger a complete systemic collapse in a rapidly developing, demographically complex Middle Eastern state.
Wow, yeah.
The environment dictates the necessary leadership physiology.
But wait, if there is no universal standard, no definitive blueprint that we can use to grade these systems, how do citizens even begin to measure if a public leader is genuinely steering the ship or just, aggressively rearranging the deck chairs while it thinks?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. And because modern standardized metrics fall short here, the framework demands we actually look backward.
Okay.
Way backward. To evaluate modern viability, the author integrates the work of a 14th century Arab polymath named Ibn Khaldun.
Okay, we are going back to the 1300s.
We are. He authored a text called the Muqaddimah, and it remains, honestly, one of the most comprehensive foundational texts on why civilizations inevitably rise and collapse.
And reading through the source material, Ibn Khaldun's analysis from the 14th century is almost uncomfortably relevant today.
Oh, it really is.
He didn't just log history, he mapped the natural life cycle of a state. He argued that nations operate on this sort of biological clock, progressing through 5 distinct stages that typically play out over 3 generations. Triumph, leisure, contentment, extravagance, and inevitably decline.
And the mechanism driving that entire life cycle is a concept he termed Asabiyyah.
Asabiyyah.
Right, which roughly translates to social cohesion or group solidarity. It is the invisible social contract that binds a group together through shared struggle.
The best way to visualize Asabiyyah for you listening is to look at a startup company in a garage, or even like a deeply underrated sports team.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. In that first generation, you have this gritty, highly unified, us against the world camaraderie.
Nobody cares about titles.
Exactly. Nobody cares about corner offices. They're pulling in the exact same direction because their collective survival depends on it. That is peak Asabiyyah.
But then they achieve triumph. They transition into the leisure and contentment phases. The shared struggle that actually generated that solidarity vanishes. Luxury takes root.
And suddenly the infighting begins. People start protecting their individual turf, arguing over credit, and that original cohesion just evaporates.
Precisely. And applying that macro scale to a nation, Ibn Khaldun identified 4 specific systemic failures that actively precipitate the final fall into extravagance and decline.
And I have to say, when I read these 4 factors, they sounded like they were pulled from this morning's financial pages.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's eerie. Well, factor number 1 is appointing unqualified individuals to positions of authority.
The dismantling of meritocracy.
Exactly. When a leadership structure begins prioritizing blind loyalty over actual competence, the administrative machinery of the state just starts misfiring.
Makes sense.
The decisions become about preserving power rather than solving complex problems.
Which feeds directly into factor number 2, right?
Yeah.
The marginalization of scholars and experts.
Yes. This is the death of forecasting.
Oh, wow.
Because when a society actively stops listening to its most educated analytical voices, it loses the capacity for evidence-based decision-making. The state effectively blinds itself.
So it's just reacting emotionally to crises instead of anticipating them.
Exactly. And then the dominoes really start falling with factor number 3, which is substituting the rule of law with coercion.
Right. Because they don't have that shared bond anymore.
Exactly. This is a direct symptom of decaying al-Asabiyyah. When the organic social cohesion is gone, the public no longer obeys the law out of a shared sense of civic duty.
So the state is forced to artificially manufacture order.
Using coercion and force. And force is incredibly resource-intensive. It requires massive surveillance, heavy policing, all of which drains the national treasury.
Which leads right to the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
Factor number 4, the exploitation of public treasuries for private gain.
Systemic corruption.
Yeah.
The leadership recognizes the underlying structure is collapsing, so they shift their focus to extracting whatever wealth remains for their own private preservation.
Basically stripping the copper wire from the walls before the building caves in.
That is exactly what it looks like.
But wait. If a society naturally and inevitably decays into luxury and division after 3 generations, doesn't that mean visionary leadership is ultimately futile?
How do you mean?
Well, are these leaders just delaying an inevitable 14th century biological clock? Are we just doomed to hit the decline phase?
It's a fair question, but the author posits that the cycle is a severe gravitational pull, not a strict predetermination.
Okay.
Exceptional strategic leadership can actually arrest the decay and even reset the clock.
Really?
Yes, but the catch is that they cannot achieve this by merely looking inward. Fixing domestic policy isn't enough because nations are constantly bombarded by external macro-level shocks.
Right, because no country exists in a vacuum. And to understand those external shocks, the author layers Ibn Khaldun's 14th century internal clock with a highly modern framework. Right?
Yes, George Modelski's long cycle theory of world order.
So we are zooming out from the life cycle of a single nation to the life cycle of global hegemonies.
Exactly. Modelski theorized that global power structures evolve through predictable cycles lasting roughly 100 years.
100 years.
Yeah. And these centuries are divided into 4 25-year phases.
Okay, walk us through those.
You begin with a period of intense global chaos and conflict. Out of that friction, a dominant global power ascends to establish a new order.
Okay.
Then, after a period of stability, that power's legitimacy gradually erodes, leading to a decentralized global arrangement.
But I'm guessing that decentralization creates a power vacuum.
Exactly, which plunges the globe right back into the phase of chaos and conflict.
So it's like the 4 seasons. You know, you can't stop winter from coming the chaos and decentralization phase, but a good leader stockpiles food and builds shelters during the summer phase.
That's a brilliant analogy. And the synthesis of these two theories is the core of the author's argument. You have Khaldun's internal clock of social cohesion ticking away simultaneously with Modelski's 100-year external clock of global power shifts.
So they are grinding against each other.
Yes. And surviving the friction when these two cycles collide requires a buffer. The author calls this buffer comprehensive national power.
Now, my initial assumption was that comprehensive power just meant having a massive defense budget, big military.
A lot of people think that.
Right. But the framework details that it must encompass military, economic, political, and cultural dimensions all operating in tandem.
Absolutely. Because if your entire economy is strictly tethered to the current global dominant power, and that power enters its 25-year decline phase...
You're going down with them.
Exactly, unless you have the political and cultural agility to pivot your alliances.
So think of Modelski's global cycles less of like the seasons of the year and more like shifting tectonic plates.
I like that.
You cannot stop the plates from moving. The 25-year phase of global decentralization and chaos is going to occur.
It's inevitable.
Right. And a standard manager attempts to patch the cracks in the road as the earthquake happens. But a strategic leader recognizes the fault lines decades in advance.
Exactly. They engineer their infrastructure to absorb the kinetic energy, and they unify the population so panic doesn't destroy the society from the inside out.
But I'm trying to map this to the leader's actual agency. Does cultivating this comprehensive power merely allow a nation to just, hunker down and survive the 100-year earthquake? Or can they actually influence the global cycle itself?
Well, the reality presented by the author is deeply pragmatic. A single public sector leader cannot halt the 100-year cycle of global power dynamics.
That makes sense.
However, by maintaining high Asabiyyah, that social cohesion and robust comprehensive power, they position their state to dictate the terms of the new order that emerges from the decentralization phase.
Oh, wow.
They transition from being a victim of the global shift to an architect of the new stability.
Okay, let's pull this out of the realm of theory and look at a contemporary real-world application. Because Dr. Al-Rasheed actually authored a book titled Saudi Arabia's Transformation, Uncertainty and Sustainability.
Yes, published in 2026.
Right. And in the piece we were reviewing today, he points directly to Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 as the operational model for navigating these exact intersecting cycles.
He does. Vision 2030 is presented as a deliberate attempt to alter the internal life cycle of the state while bracing for the external global shifts. And doing it well before a terminal crisis forced a reaction.
Which is key.
Right. The government initiated a long-term strategic vision starting around 2002 to aggressively decouple their economy from oil revenues.
And the mechanics of that decoupling are staggering. I mean, we're talking about a state whose primary comprehensive power was derived from a single dominant resource.
Literally one resource.
Right. It's like a massively successful company that only sells one product, trying to completely overhaul its business model before consumer tastes change. They essentially looked at their balance sheets during a period of massive profitability and recognized that the global tectonic plates were moving.
The shift toward renewable energy changing geopolitical alliances.
Exactly. They saw that it was going to eventually render their current model highly vulnerable.
And so they employed a mechanism the author calls adaptive governance.
Okay.
But the true test of this came not during periods of stability, but when they were hit with massive concurrent external shocks.
Like what?
Well, the severe collapse of global oil prices and, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, right.
Now, a management mindset would have paused the expensive restructuring of Vision 2030 to conserve capital.
Stop the bleeding.
Right. But the strategic leadership mindset accelerated it.
And they anchored that acceleration to a triple bottom line. They didn't just focus on economic diversification. The mandate required balancing economic, social, and environmental sustainability.
Yes.
They recognized that if they only fixed the economy but let the social or environmental pillars crack, internal cohesion, their Asabiyyah would just shatter under the pressure.
But that introduces a severe paradox in strategic leadership.
How so?
Well, executing a massive pivot like Vision 2030 requires inflicting voluntary short-term pain on the population.
Right.
You are altering subsidy structures, you're demanding new skill sets from the workforce, and you're disrupting very comfortable norms.
Which brings up a huge point of curiosity. How does a leader possibly sell voluntary pain to the public?
It's incredibly difficult.
Because if Ibn Khaldun is right, people in the contentment phase deeply resent having their comfort disrupted. If the immediate benefits aren't obvious, how do you prevent the society from fracturing?
Well, the mechanism for maintaining cohesion during a painful transition relies on anchoring the new policies to a deeply rooted cultural narrative.
Okay, explain that.
The leadership frames the economic pivot not as just some bureaucratic adjustment, but as a crucial defense of the national identity.
Ah, I see.
Furthermore, when the public witnesses the leadership maintaining course despite catastrophic external shocks like a pandemic, it builds immense institutional trust.
Because they aren't wavering.
Exactly. The pain is no longer viewed as arbitrary. It is recognized as the necessary cost of long-term survival.
Wow. Now, Al-Rasheed takes this framework of internal cohesion and external resilience and points it directly at some incredibly charged modern geopolitical conflicts.
He does.
And just to set the table for you listening before we get into this,
Yeah.
I want to be super clear. We are strictly looking through the lens of the author's arguments here to understand how his theory functions in the real world.
Right.
We aren't taking sides or endorsing these specific political views. We're just impartially reporting what is in the text. But looking at how he applies this to the Middle East, the author highlights how international friction can aggressively derail emerging domestic stability.
Yes. The author points out that while there are diplomatic pathways toward regional de-escalation, he specifically cites the U.S.-Iran agreement as an indicator of potential stability. These efforts are frequently ambushed.
Ambushed by who?
Well, the text argues that powerful, entrenched interest groups actively undermine diplomatic progress.
Right. The piece specifically levels criticism at the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and associated extremist elements.
Yes.
The author's argument is that these actors intentionally provoke conflicts to disrupt emerging regional stability, utilizing the chaos to serve narrow, immediate political and economic objectives.
And he contextualizes the specific regional friction within a broader global mechanism that he defines as predatory capitalism.
Predatory capitalism.
Right? The premise is that powerful elites in major capitals, notably Washington, prioritize their own self-interest and wealth accumulation. And they structurally rely on global instability to maintain their dominance.
It's like a rigged board game.
How do you mean?
Well, you have a few powerful players who keep flipping the board or changing the rules to hoard resources, and it leaves everyone else scrambling. The collateral damage of this mechanism is severe.
Absolutely.
The author notes that while these elites extract value from the chaos, ordinary citizens, even within the world's most dominant nations, are increasingly struggling to secure basic human needs.
Yes. The system effectively hollows out the middle class to feed the top,
leaving emerging nations scrambling to protect their resources from the fallout. So, according to the text, when faced with these deeply entrenched global interest groups, what is the public sector leader's actual responsibility? I mean, do they fight them, or do they just try to work around them and ignore the rigged game?
Well, isolation is impossible under Modelski's framework. The global cycle will eventually breach your borders.
Right.
So the author explicitly states that leaders bear a direct, active responsibility to oppose these forces. They must counter the entities that perpetuate division and war.
So they have to actively fight for the external stability required for their internal visions to actually grow.
Precisely. The strategic mandate requires championing policies that enforce equity, regional cooperation, and shared prosperity. They essentially have to engineer a regional buffer zone of stability, actively dismantling the narrow agendas that thrive on conflict.
Wow. Pulling all these dense historical and modern frameworks together, the takeaway the author leaves us with is deeply grounded.
It really is.
Effective strategic leadership doesn't waste time pursuing some frictionless utopia. It is entirely about striving to secure the best possible outcomes under prevailing, often hostile, conditions.
It is an architecture of governance built on historical awareness. I mean, the leaders who survive the coming shifts will be those who reject the short-term sugar rush of conflict and predatory extraction.
Right.
And who courageously commit to the grueling long-term work of sustainable peace and shared human dignity.
And for you listening, applying this mental model completely changes how you evaluate the leadership around you.
Completely.
Whether you are analyzing a foreign policy crisis or looking at the strategic direction of your own organization, you have to ask, is leadership just patching the servers to survive the quarter? Or are they migrating the architecture to survive the decade?
Exactly. Are they managing the current phase of the 100-year cycle, or are they building the comprehensive power to shape the next one?
And crucially, are they preserving the Asabiyyah, that vital social cohesion required to keep the group intact when the voluntary pain of transformation actually begins?
That is the ultimate test.
We want to leave you with one final provocative thought to turn over in your mind on your own. We spent a lot of time today on Ibn Khaldun's theory that social cohesion naturally decays over 3 generations as a society gets comfortable and fragmented.
Right.
Look at the mechanics of our modern world, specifically digital technology and social media algorithms.
Oh, that's a whole other layer.
Right. These platforms possess the unprecedented ability to connect us globally in an instant. Yet their underlying business models frequently rely on isolating us locally, trapping us in hyperspecific echo chambers, and monetizing our outrage.
Yeah, that is incredibly true.
So the question is, do you think this specific technology will act as an accelerant to Ibn Khaldun's 14th century cycle, destroying our social cohesion at a speed he couldn't have even imagined? Or could a genuinely strategic leader hijack those exact same mechanisms to engineer an unprecedented level of global Asabiyyah, effectively hacking the biological clock of civilization?
Answering that question might just be the defining public sector challenge of the next 50 years.
Because the historical cycles guarantee one thing: the external shocks are coming. Managing the status quo won't prevent the earthquake.
No, it won't.
The only thing that dictates survival is whether the leadership has the vision to redesign the foundation before the ground begins to shake.
As we conclude this discussion, we return to the vision expressed by Dr. Turki Faisal Al-Rasheed. A vision rooted in clarity, innovation, and a deep commitment to shaping a more stable and interconnected future. For the full article, you can find the complete details in the description below, or visit www.arabnews.com. And if you need it full story about, and to learn more about the author, visit www.tfrasheed.org. If this video gave you insight or inspired your thinking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more discussions like this. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay curious, and see you in the next video.